Sam's hands trembled holding the stranger's purse. He returned it to Rose, expecting gratitude, receiving instead a gaze that pierced through 30 years of carefully constructed fiction. "I knew your mother," she whispered, and the humid New Orleans air turned to concrete in his lungs. His name suddenly felt like a costume. His reflection in the window became a stranger's face. Rose opened her mouth again, and Sam's entire existence cracked down the middle like a foundation built on sand. Subscribe now to witness the secret that will force Sam to choose between the truth that will set him free and the lie that kept his mother alive. The leather was worn smooth by decades of anxious hands. Its burgundy surface cracked like the streets of the lower Ninth Ward after the long summer had baked them into fractured patterns. Sam held the purse with both hands, feeling the unexpected weight of it, the way it seemed heavier than a simple collection of belongings should be. He had found it wedged between the dumpster and the brick wall behind Thibodeau's corner store, half hidden beneath a flattened cardboard box that still smelled of overripe bananas and yesterday's rain. The zipper was open, revealing a tangle of receipts, a prescription bottle with a name he couldn't quite read in the dimming light, and the corner of a photograph that had been handled so many times the edges had gone soft as fabric. His fingers, still stained with motor oil despite the scrubbing he had done before leaving the garage, hovered over the contents without touching them, as if reaching inside would be a violation he wasn't prepared to commit. The evening air pressed against his skin like a damp cloth, carrying with it the mingled scents of frying catfish from the restaurant 2 blocks over. Exhaust fumes from the constant crawl of traffic on St. Claude Avenue, and something floral he couldn't identify, but that always seemed to hang in the air this time of year. Sam shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his work boots scraping against the broken asphalt, and squinted at the driver's license he had carefully extracted from the wallet inside the purse. Rose Thibodeau. The address was only 6 blocks away, in one of those narrow shotgun houses that lined the streets like dominoes waiting to fall, painted in colors that had once been vibrant but had faded under decades of punishing sun and salt air blown in from the Gulf. He knew he should just turn the purse in at the police station, let them handle the return, go home to his empty apartment and the leftover jambalaya waiting in his refrigerator. But something about the photograph's worn edges, the prescription bottle that suggested someone elderly and possibly alone, made him pocket the license and start walking. The streets transformed as he moved deeper into the neighborhood, the commercial chaos of the main avenue giving way to residential quiet, broken only by the distant bark of a dog and the rhythmic creaking of a porch swing somewhere he couldn't see. Spanish moss hung from the live oaks like tattered curtains, filtering the streetlight into irregular patterns that shifted with the breeze. Sam had lived in New Orleans his entire 32 years, had navigated these streets as a boy on his bicycle and later in his battered pickup truck, but he had never been down this particular block, had never noticed how the houses seemed to lean toward each other as if sharing secrets across the narrow gaps between them. His mother had always told him that the city held layers of history in every street corner, that you could walk the same route 100 times and still discover something new if you paid attention. He had nodded and smiled and never really understood what she meant until this moment, when the humid air seemed thick with stories he couldn't quite hear, with lives lived in proximity but separate, with the weight of time pressing down on everything. The house matched the address on the license exactly, its pale yellow paint peeling in long strips that revealed grey wood underneath, the porch sagging slightly on the left side where the foundation had probably shifted during one of the storms that periodically reminded everyone that the city existed at the mercy of forces larger than human planning could contain. A single light burned in the front window, warm and yellow against the deepening twilight, and Sam could see the silhouette of someone moving inside, slow and deliberate, the shape of a person who had learned to measure their movements with care. He climbed the 3 steps to the porch, each one groaning under his weight, and raised his hand to knock. The wood of the door was smooth under his knuckles, worn by decades of arrivals and departures, hellos and goodbyes, and he rapped 3 times, firm but not aggressive, the knock of someone who came with good news rather than bad. The door opened slowly, revealing a woman so small and bent that Sam instinctively looked down to meet her eyes. And when he did, something strange happened in his chest, a flutter like recognition, even though he had never seen this woman before in his life. Rose Thibodeau stood barely over 5 feet tall, her white hair pulled back in a loose bun that couldn't quite contain all the wayward strands. Her face a map of wrinkles that deepened when she smiled up at him with an expression that seemed equal parts surprised and somehow expected, as if she had been waiting for someone but hadn't known who or when. Her eyes were pale blue, faded like denim washed 1,000 times, but sharp and clear in a way that made Sam feel suddenly transparent, as if she could see through his skin, to the nervous flutter of his heart, to the confusion he couldn't quite name. She wore a cotton housecoat printed with tiny flowers, pink slippers that had molded to the shape of her feet, and around her neck hung a thin gold chain with a locket that caught the light from inside the house. "I found your purse," Sam said, holding it out to her like an offering, like proof that he meant no harm. His voice sounded strange in his own ears, too loud in the quiet evening, too formal for such a simple transaction. Rose's hands reached for the purse slowly, her fingers trembling slightly, whether from age or emotion he couldn't tell, and when she took it from him, her fingertips brushed against his palm, cool and dry as paper. She didn't look at the purse, didn't check its contents or express relief that it had been found. Instead, she kept her eyes locked on Sam's face, studying him with an intensity that made him want to step backward, to retreat down the sagging steps and disappear into the anonymity of the darkening streets. Her lips parted slightly, then closed again, then opened once more as if she were testing words before committing to them. "I knew your mother," she said finally, and the humid New Orleans evening suddenly felt airless, suffocating, heavy with something Sam couldn't identify, but that pressed against his ribs like a physical weight. The words hung in the space between them like a suspended note, resonating in frequencies Sam could feel but not quite hear, and for a long moment he simply stood there on Rose's sagging porch with his mouth slightly open, his brain working to process a statement that should have been simple but felt anything but. He knew that New Orleans was a city of connections, that everyone seemed related to everyone else by blood or marriage or shared history, that his mother Margaret had lived here her entire life just as he had. So meeting someone who knew her should not have been surprising. But there was something in the way Rose had said it, the way her pale blue eyes had gone distant and soft, the way her fingers had tightened on the purse as if bracing for impact, that told him this was not a casual acquaintance, not a former co-worker or neighbor who would share pleasant memories of his mother's kindness or her legendary pecan pie. This was something else entirely, something that made the air between them thick and charged, like the atmosphere before a summer storm rolls in from the Gulf. "You knew my mother," Sam repeated, not quite a question, hearing his own voice as if from a distance. And Rose nodded slowly, her whole body seeming to fold inward with the motion, growing smaller and more fragile before his eyes. She stepped back from the doorway, a wordless invitation, and Sam found himself moving forward before his conscious mind had agreed to enter, crossing the threshold into a house that smelled of lavender and old wood and something medicinal he couldn't identify. The interior was dim, lit only by a single lamp in the corner of what appeared to be both living room and dining room in the shotgun layout, where one room led directly to the next without hallways, so that you could theoretically fire a shotgun through the front door and the bullet would travel straight through to the back. The walls were covered with photographs in mismatched frames, faces from different eras, staring out with expressions ranging from stern formality to loose-limbed joy, and Sam felt their eyes following him as Rose gestured toward a worn velvet sofa that had probably been red once but had faded to the color of brick dust. He sat carefully, aware that his size and weight might overwhelm the delicate furniture, his hands resting on his knees, in a posture that felt simultaneously too formal and too vulnerable. Rose lowered herself into a wooden rocking chair that faced the sofa, moving with the slow precision of someone who had learned to negotiate their own body's limitations, and for a moment she simply rocked, the chair creaking rhythmically against the wood floor, her eyes fixed on Sam's face with that same unsettling intensity. The silence stretched between them, not quite comfortable but not hostile either, more like the pause before a confession, the breath held before the plunge. Sam's mind raced through possibilities, trying to understand what connection this elderly stranger could have to his mother that would warrant this weighted atmosphere, this sense of standing on the edge of something significant. His mother had worked as a secretary at a law firm downtown for 30 years. Had raised him alone after his father supposedly died in a construction accident before Sam was born, had lived a quiet, unremarkable life in a small rental house in Gentilly that she had never quite managed to buy despite decades of careful saving. "Margaret was beautiful," Rose said finally, her voice soft and slightly hoarse, as if she hadn't spoken aloud in days, and Sam felt something tighten in his chest because she had used the past tense, as if his mother were already gone, even though she still lived in that same rental house, still went to work 5 days a week, still called him every Sunday evening to ask if he was eating properly and getting enough sleep. "She came to me once, 32 years ago, in the summer." Rose's hands gripped the arms of the rocking chair, her knuckles going white with the pressure, and Sam noticed for the first time that her fingers were bent with arthritis, twisted into shapes that must have made even simple tasks painful. She was pregnant, terrified, and alone. The father had vanished, or maybe she had sent him away, she never quite said which, but the terror in her eyes was something I recognized because I had seen it in my own mirror decades before. The words settled over Sam like a physical weight, pressing him deeper into the worn velvet cushions, and he felt his breath come shallow and quick as the implications began to unfold in his mind, like a map he hadn't known he needed. 32 years ago, pregnant, terrified, the father had vanished. He did the math automatically, felt the numbers align with his own birth, with the story his mother had always told about his father dying in a construction accident, about her grieving young widow status, about the insurance money that had never quite materialized, but that she claimed had been tied up in legal disputes for years. "My mother never mentioned knowing anyone named Rose," Sam said, hearing the defensive edge in his own voice, the instinct to protect the woman who had raised him from whatever revelation this stranger was building toward. "She never talked about being scared or about my father leaving. She said he died." The words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Echoes of a story he had accepted without question because children accept what their parents tell them, because he had no reason to doubt the fundamental narrative of his own existence. Rose stopped rocking. The sudden stillness, somehow more unsettling than the motion had been, and leaned forward in her chair, her pale eyes locked on Sam's with an intensity that made him want to look away, but couldn't. "Margaret never knew I kept track of her," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, as if the walls might hear and judge what she was about to reveal. "But I watched from a distance, saw you grow up, saw her struggle and survive and build a life from the wreckage of that summer. I told myself I was respecting her choice to keep the secret, that it wasn't my place to interfere, that some truths are better left buried because digging them up only causes more pain than healing." She reached up with one twisted hand and touched the locket around her neck, her fingers trembling as they traced the shape of it. "But when I saw you standing on my porch tonight, when I looked into your eyes and saw his face looking back at me, I realized that secrets don't stay buried. They grow in the dark like roots under a house, invisible but powerful, and eventually they crack the foundation of everything built on top of them." The room seemed to tilt slightly, the photographs on the walls blurring in Sam's peripheral vision, and he gripped the edge of the sofa cushion with both hands to steady himself against a dizziness that had nothing to do with physical balance and everything to do with the sensation of solid ground turning to quicksand beneath him. His face. She had seen someone's face in his eyes, someone who was not his mother, someone his mother had told him was dead for 32 years. The humid air inside the house felt thick enough to drown in, and Sam opened his mouth to ask who, to demand the name that would either confirm or destroy everything he thought he knew about his own origins. But Rose was already reaching for the locket, already opening it with shaking fingers, already turning it toward him so he could see the tiny photograph inside, faded and cracked, but still clear enough to show a young man with Sam's own jawline, his own dark hair, his own eyes staring back at him across 3 decades of silence and lies and carefully constructed protection. The photograph inside the locket was no larger than a thumbnail, the kind of image that might have been cut from a larger picture. The edges not quite straight, as if someone had made the cut hastily or with trembling hands. Sam leaned forward without meaning to, drawn by the magnetic pull of recognition, by the unsettling experience of seeing his own features reflected in a stranger's face, a man frozen in time at perhaps 25 years old, or caught in a moment of laughter that made his eyes crinkle at the corners exactly the way Sam's did when something genuinely amused him. The resemblance was undeniable and deeply disturbing, like looking into a mirror that showed him not as he was, but as he might have been in another life, another context, another version of reality where the story his mother had told him for 3 decades was not a carefully constructed shield, but a deliberate erasure of this smiling man who wore Sam's face before Sam had ever existed. Rose held the locket steady, despite the tremor in her hands, giving Sam time to absorb the image, to trace the familiar contours of the stranger's features, to feel the first cracks spreading through the foundation of his identity like fault lines, awakening after years of dormant pressure. His name was Daniel Laurent, she said, her voice carrying the weight of a confession that had been held too long, words that had fermented in silence until they had become almost toxic with their own suppression. He was my nephew, my sister's youngest son, wild and charming in the way that young men sometimes are when they don't yet understand that actions have consequences that outlive moments of passion. She closed the locket with a soft click that seemed too loud in the hushed interior of the house, the sound marking a boundary crossed, a revelation that could not be taken back or softened or undone. He met your mother at a music festival in City Park, one of those humid June evenings when the air is so thick you can barely breathe and the music makes you feel like anything is possible, like the normal rules of life don't apply. Sam felt his hands begin to shake, a tremor that started in his fingers and spread up through his arms into his shoulders, and he clenched his fists against his thighs to still the movement, to maintain some illusion of control, even as everything he thought he knew about himself was being systematically dismantled by this elderly woman, rocking gently in her chair, as if she were discussing the weather rather than exploding the central myth of his existence. Daniel was 24, working construction during the day and playing guitar in bars at night, dreaming of making it as a musician, even though he barely had enough money to keep his guitar in decent repair. Rose continued, her eyes going distant as she spoke, looking not at Sam, but at something or someone visible only in the landscape of memory. Margaret was 23, Fresh from college, with a degree in English literature and dreams of becoming a writer, working as a secretary to pay the bills while she tried to figure out what kind of life she wanted to build. They collided like thunderstorms, all electricity and noise and intensity, and for 3 months that summer they were inseparable. The timeline aligned with brutal precision, the dates matching the year of Sam's birth, the summer months corresponding to the conception that would have preceded his November arrival. And Sam felt a strange sensation of vertigo, even though he was sitting perfectly still, as if the room itself were spinning around a fixed point that was his body growing increasingly unreal to him. "What happened?" he asked, his voice coming out rougher than he intended, scraped raw by emotions he couldn't quite name, but that felt like grief and anger and betrayal all mixed together into something that burned in his throat. Why did he leave? Why did my mother tell me he was dead? The questions tumbled out faster than Rose could answer them, each one an accusation and a plea, a demand for clarity in a situation that seemed designed to resist simple explanations, to sprawl in all directions like the roots Rose had mentioned earlier, cracking foundations and destabilizing structures that had seemed solid. Rose's face crumpled slightly, the wrinkles deepening into canyons of regret, and she raised one twisted hand to her mouth as if physically holding back words that wanted to escape before she was ready to release them. "Daniel didn't leave," she said finally, and the 3 words landed with the force of a physical blow, stunning Sam into a silence so complete he could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, could hear the distant sound of traffic from blocks away, could hear the house settling around them with small creaks and sighs. "At least not in the way you're imagining. He wanted to marry your mother, was excited about becoming a father, started picking up extra shifts to save money for a ring and a small apartment they could share. But Margaret was terrified, not of motherhood exactly, but of something else, something she never fully explained to him or to me, some terror that seemed to go deeper than the normal anxieties of an unplanned pregnancy." Rose leaned back in her rocking chair, the motion setting it in motion again, the rhythmic creak marking time like a metronome, counting down to the revelation Sam both needed and feared to hear. "Margaret came to me one evening in late July, when the heat was so oppressive that even breathing felt like labor, and she asked me if I knew how to make someone disappear," Rose continued, her voice dropping even lower, forcing Sam to lean forward to catch every word. "Not literally disappear, not violence or anything like that, but how to make someone believe that staying would cause more harm than leaving. How to convince someone that the best gift they could give was their absence. I should have refused to help her, should have talked her out of whatever plan was forming in her mind, but there was something in her eyes that reminded me of myself when I was young, some core of desperation that I recognized because I had felt it, and I made the worst decision of my life." She paused, the rocking chair stilling again, and reached for a glass of water on the small table beside her, her hands shaking so badly that some of the liquid sloshed over the rim and dripped onto the wooden floor, dark spots appearing on the old planks like tears. "I helped her fake a crisis," Rose said, setting the glass down with exaggerated care, as if the act of confession had weakened her to the point where even simple movements required concentration. "I told Daniel that Margaret had been seeing another man, that the baby might not be his, that she had been using him for financial support while carrying on with someone else. I made it convincing, showed him falsified letters I had written in Margaret's handwriting, created an entire fiction that painted your mother as someone cruel and calculating, when in reality she was just terrified of something I didn't understand and still don't." The words hung in the air like smoke, bitter and acrid, and Sam felt something inside his chest crack open, a sensation not quite like pain, but similar, as if his heart were a geode being split to reveal the crystalline structures hidden inside, sharp and glittering and capable of cutting anyone who touched them carelessly. Daniel believed me because he trusted me, because I was his aunt, and he had no reason to think I would destroy him deliberately. He left New Orleans the next day, took a bus to Houston and then further west, and by the time your mother gave birth in November, he was somewhere in California trying to forget a woman who had never actually betrayed him. The confessions settled over the room like sediment drifting to the bottom of disturbed water, and Sam sat motionless in the wake of it, his mind struggling to process the layers of deception that had shaped his entire existence without his knowledge or consent. His mother, Margaret, whom he had always known as honest to the point of bluntness, incapable of even the smallest social lie, had constructed an elaborate fiction about his father's death and maintained it for 32 years without ever showing a crack in the facade. And Rose, this elderly woman sitting across from him with tears now sliding silently down her weathered cheeks, had been complicit in that fiction, had actively destroyed a young man's faith in love and family in order to grant Margaret's desperate wish for absence. The weight of it pressed against Sam's chest like a physical object, heavy and unyielding, making each breath feel like an accomplishment rather than an automatic function. "Where is he now?" Sam asked, his voice barely above a whisper, the question emerging from some deep place inside him that he hadn't known existed until this moment. A need to locate the man whose genetic material comprised half of his existence, but whom he had never met, never known, never even been permitted to grieve properly, because you cannot mourn someone you believe died before you could remember them. Rose flinched at the question, her body contracting as if Sam had struck her, and she shook her head slowly, the motion carrying a finality that Sam felt in his bones before she even spoke the words. "Daniel died 7 years ago," she said, her voice breaking on the last word, and Sam felt something inside him collapse, not the dramatic shattering he might have expected, but a slow, inward folding, like a building imploding floor by floor, until nothing remained but dust and the memory of structure. Liver failure, from drinking too much for too many years, trying to drown whatever pain I had planted in him when I lied about your mother's faithfulness. The revelation that his biological father was not only absent but permanently beyond reach opened a chasm inside Sam that seemed to have no bottom, a void where questions could fall forever without ever landing on solid ground or finding satisfactory answers. He would never hear Daniel's voice, never see if they shared mannerisms beyond physical features, never have the opportunity to ask why he hadn't fought harder for Margaret, why he had believed Rose's lies so completely that he had fled the state and never looked back. The stolen future spread out before Sam's imagination like a landscape glimpsed in a dream. All the birthdays and graduations and ordinary moments that should have included a father, but had instead contained only absence, shaped into the fiction of noble death. "Did he know?" Sam asked, his hands clenching and unclenching against his thighs, the motion mechanical and unconscious. "Before he died, did he ever find out that I existed, that my mother had lied about the other man, that he had a son who was told he was dead?" Rose's face crumpled completely at the question, decades of guilt finally overwhelming whatever composure she had been maintaining, and she pressed both hands over her mouth as sobs shook her small frame, the rocking chair moving wildly beneath her as if the furniture itself were responding to her anguish. Sam sat frozen, watching her cry, feeling nothing and everything simultaneously, his emotional circuitry overloaded to the point of shutdown. When Rose finally regained enough control to speak, her voice came out strangled and thick with mucus from crying. "I tried to tell him," she said, the words barely intelligible through her continued weeping. 5 years ago, when I heard he was sick, When I knew he didn't have much time left, I tracked him down to a veterans hospital in Sacramento where he was being treated. I flew out there with photographs of you that I had collected over the years, pictures I had taken from a distance at your high school graduation, at the garage where you work, just candid shots of you living your life without knowing you were being watched. No, the admission should have been creepy, should have made Sam angry at this invasion of privacy, but instead he felt only a numb curiosity, a detached interest in the mechanics of his own surveillance. I walked into his hospital room with this envelope full of evidence that his entire heartbreak had been based on a lie, ready to give him the truth, even if it came 3 decades too late to change anything, Rose continued, her crying subsiding into occasional hitching breaths as she forced the story out. But when I saw him lying in that bed, his skin yellow from jaundice, his body so wasted from disease that he barely looked human anymore, I couldn't do it. I couldn't give him one more piece of pain to carry into whatever came next, couldn't burden him with the knowledge that he had abandoned a son who existed, that he had spent 30 years hating a woman who had never actually betrayed him, that his entire adult life had been shaped by a lie I had told to serve someone else's fear. She opened her eyes and looked directly at Sam, her pale blue gaze meeting his with an intensity that felt like being seen for the first time. Truly seen, not as the person he had been pretending to be for 32 years, but as the confused and angry and grieving man he was discovering himself to actually be. I told myself I was being merciful, letting him die in peace, but the truth is, I was a coward. I was protecting myself from his rage, from having to admit what I had done, from having to face the consequences of a decision I made when I was younger and stupider and thought I was helping. Sam stood abruptly, the motion sending the worn velvet sofa creaking in protest, and began pacing the small living room, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, his hands moving through the air as if trying to physically grasp some logic in the chaos of revelation that surrounded him. The photographs on the walls seemed to watch him with judgment or pity, or perhaps just the blank indifference of images trapped in time, unable to offer wisdom or comfort or anything beyond their frozen moments of captured life. "My mother," he said, stopping mid-pace to face Rose, the words coming out sharp and accusatory, despite his attempt to control his tone. Why did she do it? What was she so afraid of that she would rather tell me my father was dead than let him be part of my life? Was he violent? Was there abuse I don't know about? What could possibly justify lying to a child for his entire life about something as fundamental as where he came from? The questions felt inadequate even as he asked them, too small to contain the magnitude of betrayal and confusion swirling inside him. But they were all he had, the only tools available to try to chisel some shape from the formless mass of information Rose had dumped in his lap. Rose stood as well, moving slowly from the rocking chair to stand before Sam, and even diminished by age and bent by arthritis, she seemed to gain a kind of authority as she prepared to share the final piece of the puzzle, the central secret that explained all the other secrets branching from it. "Your mother was not afraid of Daniel," she said, her voice steadier now, as if the worst of the confession was behind her, and what remained was merely terrible rather than unforgivable. She was afraid of herself, of what she might become if she allowed herself to depend on another person completely. If she let herself believe in the kind of love that Daniel was offering. Margaret's mother, your grandmother, had been in an abusive marriage for 20 years before she finally found the courage to leave when Margaret was 16. Your mother grew up watching her mother slowly disappear, watching her become a ghost who moved through the house in silence, flinching at loud noises, apologizing for existing. When Margaret got pregnant with you, when Daniel started talking about marriage and building a life together, something broke inside her. She became convinced that any relationship would eventually follow the same pattern, that love was just a pretty word for the slow erosion of self. And she decided that she would rather raise you alone than risk becoming her mother. The explanation landed with a different kind of weight than the previous revelations. Not the sharp shock of learning his father hadn't died, but the slow, heavy pressure of understanding that his mother's lies had been born not from cruelty, but from a trauma so deep she had been willing to destroy her own chance at love rather than risk repeating patterns she had witnessed as a child. Sam sank back onto the sofa, his legs suddenly unable to support him, and buried his face in his hands, feeling the rough texture of his own palms against his cheeks, grounding himself in the physical sensation because everything else felt like it was floating away from him, untethered from any reality he recognized. "She never told me," he said into his hands, his voice muffled and distant. "She never mentioned her father being abusive, never talked about her mother leaving. She just said her parents died in a car accident when she was young. Another lie, another piece of fiction designed to keep me from asking questions that might lead to uncomfortable truths." The realization that his entire family history was potentially fabricated, that every story he had been told might be another layer of protective deception, made him feel as if he were dissolving, his sense of self dependent on a narrative that was proving to be as substantial as morning mist burned away by the harsh light of revelation. Sam left Rose's house near midnight, stumbling down the sagging porch steps with the photograph clutched in his hand. A copy Rose had insisted he take from an album she kept hidden in her bedroom closet. Images of Daniel, collected through the years before his death, as if maintaining this archive could somehow absolve her of the role she had played in destroying his life. The streets of New Orleans were never truly empty, even at this late hour. The city breathing with its own nocturnal rhythm of music spilling from bars, couples walking home with arms entwined, the occasional taxi cruising past with its light on, hunting for fares. But Sam felt utterly alone as he walked without destination through neighborhoods that should have been familiar, but felt foreign now. As if learning the truth about his origin had somehow altered the physical landscape of his life, rewriting the city itself into a place he no longer recognized or understood. The photograph showed Daniel at perhaps 23, leaning against what appeared to be a construction site fence, his work clothes dusted with sawdust or drywall powder, his hair longer than Sam had ever worn his own, falling past his ears in dark waves that looked like they would be soft to touch. But it was the expression that stopped Sam every time he looked at the image, a kind of openness in Daniel's face that suggested he had not yet learned to guard himself against the world, that he still believed people were fundamentally good, and life was fundamentally fair, and love would be enough to overcome whatever obstacles might arise. Sam wondered at what point that openness had been replaced by the suspicion and bitterness Rose had described, at what exact moment Daniel had stopped believing in human goodness and started believing in betrayal instead. The transformation must have been instant, he thought, like a switch being flipped when Rose delivered her carefully constructed lies, the openness closing like a door slamming shut, locking something inside Daniel that would slowly poison him over the following decades until his liver finally quit, and his body became a casualty of emotional wounds that had never healed. He found himself walking toward his mother's house without consciously deciding to do so, his feet carrying him along routes he had traveled thousands of times, his body operating on autopilot, while his mind churned through the implications of everything Rose had revealed. The house appeared before him like a stage set, modest and neat, with flower boxes under the windows that Margaret tended religiously despite her lack of natural gardening talent, the result of effort rather than skill, a determination to create beauty even when it didn't come naturally. Sam stood on the sidewalk, staring at the structure that had been his childhood home, the place where he had learned to walk and read and fix things with his hands, because Margaret had always encouraged his mechanical aptitude, even though she couldn't tell a screwdriver from a wrench. Every memory he had was contained within those walls, every birthday cake and scraped knee and late-night conversation about his dreams and fears. And now all of it felt contaminated by the knowledge that the fundamental story underlying everything had been false. The living room light was still on, despite the late hour, his mother's habit of reading before bed, leaving the house softly illuminated from within like a lantern. And Sam could see her silhouette through the curtains, moving across the room with a book in her hands, probably heading to the kitchen to make her nightly cup of chamomile tea that she claimed helped her sleep better, though Sam had always suspected it was more ritual than remedy. He should go inside, he thought. He should knock on the door or use his key and confront her immediately with Rose's revelations. Demand explanations and apologies, and some kind of accounting for the 32 years of lies that had shaped his understanding of himself. But his body refused to move forward, rooted to the sidewalk by some combination of fear and anger, and a strange protective instinct that recognized how devastating this conversation would be for Margaret. How completely it would shatter whatever peace she had managed to construct for herself in the decades since she had made her terrible choice. Sam thought about Daniel dying in a hospital in Sacramento, alone except for the medical staff, and perhaps a few friends who had known only the bitter, alcoholic version of him rather than the open-faced young man in the photograph. He tried to imagine what his father's life might have been like if Rose had never delivered her poison, if Margaret had found the courage to let him stay, if Sam had grown up with both parents instead of in the careful bubble of his mother's anxiety and overprotection. The alternative history spread out in his mind like a movie he could never watch, tantalizing and forever inaccessible. A life where maybe he would have learned to play guitar instead of working on engines, where maybe Daniel's charm and Margaret's intelligence would have combined in him differently, where maybe he would have grown up less serious and more willing to take risks because he had the safety net of two parents instead of the desperate need to be good and stable and undemanding that came from knowing your mother was doing everything alone. But alternate histories were fantasies, Sam reminded himself, useless exercises that changed nothing about the reality he actually inhabited. Daniel was dead 7 years, had died believing Margaret had betrayed him, had spent decades drowning in alcohol and bitterness because Rose had convinced him that love was a lie and people were fundamentally untrustworthy. And Margaret had raised Sam alone, had worked herself to exhaustion to provide for him, had sacrificed whatever chance at happiness she might have had with Daniel or anyone else, because she was too damaged by her own childhood trauma to believe that love could be anything other than the slow murder of self. The tragedy of it threatened to overwhelm Sam, the sense that everyone involved had been acting from their own wounds, creating new wounds in the process, perpetuating cycles of pain that stretched back generations and forward into futures that were already being shaped by decisions made in fear rather than hope. He turned away from his mother's house without knocking, unable to face her yet, needing more time to process what he knew before he could articulate what he needed to say. The photograph of Daniel felt heavy in his pocket, a physical reminder that he carried his father's face, his father's genetics, his father's legacy of abandonment, whether that abandonment had been chosen or forced. Sam walked aimlessly through the dark streets, the humid air wrapping around him like a living thing, and wondered how he would ever look at his own reflection again without seeing the ghost of a man who had died too young, poisoned by lies told in the name of protection, sacrificed to someone else's fear of becoming their mother. The weight of inheritance pressed down on him, the recognition that trauma doesn't end with the person who experiences it, but ripples outward through time and relationships and choices, shaping lives that haven't even begun yet, determining futures before they have a chance to unfold naturally. Sam carried his father's face and his mother's fear, and somewhere in the space between those two inheritances, he would have to figure out who he actually was, beyond the lies and losses that had made him. 3 days passed, in a fog that felt less like living and more like watching someone else perform the actions of daily life, while Sam observed from a distance. He went to work at the garage, his hands performing familiar tasks with automatic precision, replacing brake pads and changing oil and diagnosing mysterious engine noises. But his mind remained trapped in the small living room of Rose's house, replaying the conversation over and over, searching for details he might have missed or interpretations he might have gotten wrong. His co-workers noticed the change, commenting that he seemed distracted, asking if everything was okay, but Sam deflected their concern with vague excuses about not sleeping well, about some personal matter he was working through, maintaining the fiction of normalcy even as his interior world was undergoing a transformation that felt seismic and irreversible. His mother called twice during those 3 days, leaving voicemails that sounded cheerful and ordinary, asking if he wanted to come for dinner on Sunday, mentioning that she had made his favorite gumbo and it was too much for one person, saying she had seen a funny story on the news that reminded her of something from his childhood. Sam listened to the messages multiple times, analyzing her tone for evidence of the fear and trauma Rose had described, searching for signs of the carefully constructed deception that had governed his entire life. But Margaret's voice sounded exactly as it always had, warm and slightly worried, in the way mothers worry about their children, regardless of how old those children become. And Sam felt his anger complicate into something more difficult to navigate, a mixture of betrayal and understanding, rage and compassion, the desire to confront, and the equally powerful desire to protect her from the consequences of her own choices. On the 4th day after his conversation with Rose, Sam received a text message from an unknown number, and when he opened it, he found an image that made his breath catch in his throat with the shock of recognition. The photograph showed a young Margaret, no more than 23, standing next to Daniel in what appeared to be City Park, Spanish moss hanging from the live oaks behind them, both of them laughing at something beyond the frame, their bodies angled toward each other with the unmistakable magnetism of people who cannot get enough of each other's presence. Margaret's hair was longer than Sam had ever seen it, falling past her shoulders in waves that suggested she had just come from swimming or dancing, and her face was open and unguarded in a way Sam had never witnessed, as if whoever she was in that moment had been a different person than the careful, controlled woman who had raised him. The message accompanying the photo read simply, "Thought you should see what they were like together. Rose." Sam stared at the image for so long that his phone screen went dark twice, requiring him to wake it again to continue his examination of these two young people who looked so happy and so doomed simultaneously, their joy captured and frozen in a moment that existed outside of time, immune to the decisions and lies and tragedies that would follow. He noticed small details with each viewing. The way Daniel's hand rested on Margaret's shoulder with casual possessiveness, the way Margaret leaned into that touch as if drawing strength from it, the matching bracelets they wore on their left wrists, simple leather cords with wooden beads that suggested they had been handmade or purchased from a street vendor, tokens of affection that probably cost almost nothing but meant everything. Sam wondered what had happened to Margaret's bracelet, whether she had kept it all these years hidden somewhere in her house, a secret reminder of the summer before everything changed, or whether she had thrown it away in the aftermath of sending Daniel away, unable to bear the physical evidence of what she had lost. The photograph forced Sam to confront a reality he had been avoiding. His mother had loved Daniel. Whatever fear had driven her to send him away, it had not been lack of feeling, but an excess of it, a terror so profound that it outweighed even the powerful attraction between them. Rose's explanation about Margaret's childhood, about watching her mother slowly disappear into an abusive marriage, began to make more sense in the context of this image, because the level of openness and vulnerability Margaret displayed here would have been terrifying to someone convinced that all love eventually mutated into destruction. Sam could almost understand the logic, twisted though it was, that had led his mother to believe that ending things while she still had agency was preferable to waiting for the inevitable moment when love would transform into something suffocating and dangerous. The tragedy was that Daniel had not been Margaret's father, would likely never have become the kind of man who needed to control and diminish his partner. But Margaret's trauma did not allow her to see that distinction, to recognize that her father's violence was not encoded in all masculinity waiting to emerge. Sam sat in his truck outside the garage during his lunch break, the photograph of Daniel and Margaret still glowing on his phone screen, and tried to imagine the conversation he would need to have with his mother about all of this. How did you confront someone with a lie that had been told out of terror rather than malice? How did you express anger at being deceived while simultaneously acknowledging that the deception came from a place of profound psychological damage? How did you demand accountability without causing more harm to someone who had already been harmed enough by their own history? The questions spiraled without resolution, each answer suggesting 3 more questions, until Sam felt like he was drowning in ethical complexity, unable to find solid ground anywhere. Part of him wanted to rage at Margaret, to unleash all the confusion and loss and stolen possibilities that her choices had cost him and Daniel, and probably herself as well. But another part of him, maybe the larger part, just felt sad for everyone involved, for the cycles of trauma that repeated across generations, turning people who wanted to love into people who feared love so much they destroyed it preemptively. His phone rang, shattering his rumination, and when Sam looked at the screen, he saw his mother's name, her familiar contact photo smiling up at him from what must have been 10 years ago. Her hair less grey, her face less lined, but still recognizably Margaret, still wearing the careful expression she usually presented to the world. Sam's finger hovered over the answer button, paralyzed by indecision, knowing that once he answered, once he heard her voice, the pretense of normalcy would become impossible to maintain, and they would be hurtling inevitably toward the confrontation he both needed and dreaded. The phone continued to ring, insistent and demanding, and finally Sam pressed the answer button before he could talk himself out of it, lifting the device to his ear and hearing his mother's voice, slightly worried as always, asking if he was okay, saying she hadn't heard from him in almost a week, which was unusual, wondering if maybe she had done something to upset him without realizing it because she knew she could be thoughtless sometimes, could say things that came out wrong even when she meant well. The concern in her voice was genuine, Sam knew, the worry of a mother for her child that transcended all the lies and secrets. And he felt his carefully constructed anger beginning to crack, giving way to something more complicated and harder to articulate, something that felt like grief for all of them, for the people they might have been if history had unfolded differently. Sam arrived at his mother's house as the first light was beginning to break over the city, the sky transforming from black to deep purple to the pale orange that preceded sunrise, and he sat in his truck for 15 minutes, watching the color shift and change, gathering courage for what he was about to do. He had called Margaret back after the phone conversation, had told her he needed to talk to her about something important, something that couldn't wait, but also couldn't be discussed over the phone, and her voice had gone tight with the kind of maternal anxiety that always manifested when she sensed something was wrong with him. She had told him to come over whenever he wanted, that she would be awake, that she would make coffee, and the ordinariness of her response had made Sam want to weep, because soon that ordinariness would be shattered and replaced with something infinitely more complicated and painful. He knocked, rather than using his key, a formality that felt necessary given the magnitude of what was about to happen, and Margaret opened the door, wearing her bathrobe and slippers, her hair uncombed, her face showing the kind of naked vulnerability people only display to those they trust completely. The sight of her like this, unguarded and clearly worried about him, made Sam's prepared speech evaporate. All the carefully rehearsed phrases about truth and lies and the right to know his own history suddenly seeming too harsh, too accusatory for this woman who looked smaller and older than he remembered, as if the last 4 days had aged her in ways he was only now noticing. "Come in, baby," she said, using the childhood endearment she still employed despite his being 32 years old, and Sam followed her into the kitchen that smelled of brewing coffee and the faint scent of lavender from the sachets she kept in every room. Her attempt to bring calm into spaces that always seemed to carry tension in the walls themselves. They sat at the small kitchen table, where Sam had eaten thousands of meals, where Margaret had helped him with homework and listened to his teenage complaints about school and girlfriends and the various injustices he had perceived in his limited world. And for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence filled only by the rhythmic drip of the coffee maker and the distant sound of a car passing on the street outside. Sam placed the photograph of Daniel and Margaret on the table between them, the image from City Park with its evidence of joy and connection and a future that had never materialized, and he watched his mother's face as she registered what she was seeing, watched the color drain from her cheeks, watched her hands begin to tremble as they reached for the photograph but stopped halfway, hovering in the air as if she were afraid that touching the image would somehow make it more real, would confirm that the past she had tried so hard to bury had been excavated and brought into the light. "Rose Thibodeau came to see me," Sam said, his voice sounding strange in the quiet kitchen, too loud and too formal, the words of a stranger rather than a son. "Actually, I returned her lost purse and she told me she knew you. She told me about Daniel Laurent. She told me everything." The accusation in his tone was unmistakable, despite his attempt to remain calm, and Margaret's face crumpled as she finally touched the photograph, her fingers tracing Daniel's face with a tenderness that spoke of grief so old and deep it had become part of her cellular structure, woven into her being so completely that she probably couldn't remember what it felt like to exist without carrying it. "You lied to me," Sam continued, the words gaining momentum now that he had started, building like water breaking through a dam that had held for too long. "My entire life you told me my father died before I was born, that he was a good man who loved you, that he died in a construction accident, but he didn't die until 7 years ago, in California, alone and bitter and destroyed by lies that Rose told him at your request." Margaret's breath came in short, sharp gasps, her body beginning to shake with the force of suppressed sobs, and Sam felt his anger collide with his compassion, both emotions equally powerful and equally demanding of expression. "I wanted to protect you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, the words emerging from some deep place where she had been storing this explanation for 3 decades, waiting for the moment when it would finally be required. Not just from Daniel, but from me, from the possibility that I would turn into my mother, that I would let a man slowly erase me until I was nothing but a shadow moving through rooms, apologizing for breathing. I watched my father destroy my mother piece by piece, watched her become someone I didn't recognize, and when I got pregnant with you, When Daniel started talking about marriage and forever, I panicked. I convinced myself that all relationships followed the same pattern, that love was just the beginning of dissolution, and I decided that being alone was safer than taking the chance. The explanation landed exactly as Rose had predicted it would, offering understanding without offering absolution, and Sam felt tears beginning to form in his own eyes, his vision blurring as he looked at his mother across the table where she sat hunched and small and infinitely fragile. "But it wasn't your choice alone to make," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Daniel deserved to know he had a son. I deserved to know my father. Rose never should have lied for you, and you never should have asked her to. You took away all our possibilities because you were scared. And that fear poisoned everything, destroyed Daniel's life, gave me a childhood built on fiction, and trapped you in a prison of your own making." The words felt simultaneously too harsh and not harsh enough, unable to capture the full scope of damage that had radiated outward from that summer 32 years ago, touching lives and twisting futures in ways that could never be fully quantified or repaired. Margaret stood abruptly from the table, moving to the window that overlooked her small backyard, her back to Sam, her shoulders shaking with the force of crying she was trying to suppress, and Sam watched her silhouette against the growing light outside, seeing not just his mother, but the scared 23-year-old woman she had been, pregnant and terrified, and convinced that the only way to survive was to cut away anything that might have the power to hurt her. "I know," she said finally, her voice thick with tears and guilt, and a grief that seemed to encompass not just what had been lost, but what had never been given a chance to exist. "I know I destroyed everything because I was too broken to believe in anything good. I know Daniel died hating a version of me that never existed. And I know you grew up without a father who would have loved you. And I know that every single day for 32 years I have carried the weight of what I did, wondering if I made the right choice, knowing I probably didn't but unable to undo it, unable to go back and be braver or healthier or more willing to take risks." She turned from the window to face Sam, her face wet with tears, her eyes red and swollen, and in that moment Sam saw not just his mother, but also himself, saw the ways he had internalized her fear and caution, the ways he had learned to keep people at a distance because he had been raised by someone who treated connection as dangerous, saw how trauma moves through families like water through soil, invisible, but shaping everything that tries to grow. "I don't know how to forgive you yet," Sam said, his own tears now falling freely, no longer trying to maintain any pretense of composure. "I don't know if I can forgive Rose, or forgive Daniel for believing the lies instead of fighting for you, or forgive myself for never asking harder questions about why certain topics were always avoided. But I also don't know how to hate you completely, because I understand that you were acting from wounds I never had to carry, trying to protect me from dangers you believed were inevitable, even if they weren't real." The morning light continued to strengthen, filling the kitchen with the soft glow that comes just after sunrise, and mother and son stood on opposite sides of the small room, separated by 32 years of lies and losses and the terrible complexity of loving someone whose choices had caused profound harm, even when those choices came from places of profound pain. Margaret moved toward Sam slowly, as if approaching a frightened animal that might bolt at any sudden movement, and when she reached him, she opened her arms in a gesture that was both request and offering, leaving it to Sam to decide whether to accept the embrace or reject it. For a long moment, Sam stood frozen, suspended between the need to maintain the purity of his anger and the equally powerful need for the comfort only a mother can provide. And finally he stepped forward, allowing himself to be pulled into Margaret's arms, feeling her small frame shaking against him. feeling his own body respond with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his lungs, grief pouring out for Daniel, who had died alone, for Margaret, who had lived in fear, for himself, who had grown up in the shadow of secrets that had shaped him in ways he was only beginning to understand. They stood like that as the city woke around them, the sounds of traffic and birds and distant voices creating a soundtrack to their shared mourning. And Sam knew that this embrace was not resolution, not forgiveness, not even the beginning of healing, but simply the acknowledgement that despite everything, despite the lies and the losses and the poisoned legacies, they were bound together by blood and history and the complicated reality of being human in a world that offers no perfect choices, only the attempt to survive with whatever damaged tools we inherit from those who came before us. The photograph of Daniel and Margaret remained on the table, evidence of a moment when anything seemed possible. When the future was unwritten and hope had not yet been crushed by fear, and Sam wondered if he would ever be able to look at his own reflection again without seeing not just his father's face, but also the warning it carried. That love is risk, that openness is vulnerability, and that the choice between protecting yourself and allowing yourself to be fully known is one that shapes not just your own life, but the lives of everyone who comes after you, rippling forward through time in ways you can neither predict nor prevent nor escape.